After his mother's sudden death, 9-year-old Liam stopped speaking, not to his aunt, not to his teachers, not even to himself. But in the ruins of a forgotten chapel, buried beneath snow and silence, he met a cat with ears curled like question marks, and somehow, the words found their way back. This is not a story about a miracle. It's a story about a boy, a cat, and the quiet kind of love that stays when everything else has gone. Whisker, the curl that found a home. The storm had passed, but grief had not. In the quiet town of Maple Hollow, winter wasn't measured by days on a calendar, was measured by the weight of what was missing. In a house where laughter used to live, a boy no longer spoke. And in an old chapel where no one prayed, a stray cat curled beneath a broken pew, waiting. Not for food, not for warmth, but for someone who needed him more than he could ever know. The storm had passed, but Maple Hollow was far from quiet. It was the kind of small town where people still shoveled snow from each other's porches and left casseroles on doorsteps without asking. Nestled deep in northern Oregon, it sat between a range of frozen hills and an aging forest that had long since lost its color to the cold. The blizzard had swept through 2 nights ago, leaving the town blanketed in a hush of white. Roads remained half buried, and the skeletal trees still groaned under the weight of the storm's fury. Most folks stayed in, bundling themselves near fireplaces with hot drinks and familiar silences, but not everyone sought warmth. Just outside the edge of town stood a chapel long left to decay. The Maple Hollow Old First Parish, as the faded wooden sign still read, hadn't held a congregation in over 12 years. The building leaned slightly now, its steeple missing slats, the bell long gone. Broken panes let in wind and pine needles. Within its walls, old pews stood in crooked rows like soldiers too tired to straighten. The altar was covered in dust thick enough to soften footsteps, and only the light from a fractured stained-glass window painted any color inside. Curled beneath the first row of pews, breathing slow and silent, was Whisker. He was no ordinary stray. His fur was a warm shade of creamy beige, with soft swirls of darker brown curling along his spine and flanks like melted caramel. His build was lean, elegant, with paws that moved so lightly across the wooden floor you'd think he floated. But it was his ears bending gently backwards in that iconic American curl shape that made him unmistakable. Like delicate commas on his head, they gave him an expression of permanent curiosity or quiet amusement, even when he was utterly still. Whisker had arrived the day after the storm. No one had seen where he came from, and no one had noticed him slipping into the old chapel, save for a squirrel that darted from a shattered window frame in a panic. He made no noise. He didn't meow, didn't scratch, didn't chase. He simply settled in beneath the pew, his body forming a perfect circle, and wait though, even he didn't seem to know for what. Far across town, in a small rental unit with a rusting mailbox and a crooked porch light, Liam Hargrove, age 9, sat at the kitchen table with a pair of red mittens clenched in his hands. Liam was a quiet boy even before the accident, but since his mother, Rachel Hargrove, had passed away in a car crash just 3 weeks prior, he hadn't said more than a dozen words. His father wasn't in the picture, hadn't been for years, and he now lived under the temporary care of Martha Bell, his mother's cousin. Martha was a stout, broad-shouldered woman in her late 50s, with short gray curls and a voice roughened by years of cigarette smoke and saying things she didn't mean. She wasn't unkind, but she wasn't patient either, and grief made the air in the house tighter than the windows during a frost. That afternoon, while Martha napped in the recliner with a news channel murmuring in the background, Liam slipped on his boots, tucked the mittens in his coat pocket, and stepped into the snow. He didn't know why he walked toward the chapel. Maybe it was memory. His mother had taken him there once, years ago, when he was too young to understand the words in prayer, but old enough to remember the smell of wood polish and wax, the way her hand wrapped over his like a promise. That warmth had vanished now, but the place remained somehow still standing when everything else felt like it had fallen. The walk took longer than it should have. Snow reached up to his knees in places, and his boots soaked through, but when he saw the chapel's pointed roof rising against the gray sky, something pulled in his chest. He stepped up the loose wooden steps, pushed the crooked door open, and felt the rush of cold air greet him like an old friend. The inside was darker than he remembered, colder, dusty in the corners and silent except for the wind's soft hum through the broken glass. He didn't call out. He just stepped in, snow dripping from his cuffs, breath puffing in front of him. And then he saw them. Eyes. Two perfect orbs, round and green like glass marbles, peered at him from beneath the front pew. For a heartbeat, Liam froze. The eyes didn't blink. Then, slowly, a shape emerged, a lithe, small body, fur warmed in color, even in the gray light. Ears curved back, tail curled around front paws. The cat didn't move. Neither did the boy. Liam crouched down without thinking, his knees touching the freezing wooden floor. "Hi," he said. It came out hoarse, like a word that hadn't been used in weeks. Maybe it hadn't. The cat blinked slowly once, then again. Liam reached into his coat and pulled out one red mitten. He placed it on the floor between them like an offering. "I didn't think anyone would be here," he said, quieter this time. "But I guess you are." The cat didn't respond, of course, but it didn't run either. It lowered its head, rested its chin on its paws, and closed its eyes. Liam stayed there a while, watching. The silence wasn't empty now. It was shared. The days that followed were cold, but not as hollow as before. Snow had settled thick across Maple Hollow, hiding the sidewalks and burying the past in inches of silence. Liam began slipping away from his Aunt Martha's house more often, usually after lunch, always without a word. Martha didn't ask where he was going. She wasn't the type to hover. In her 50s, short and square-shouldered with tired blue eyes, Martha Bell had seen more than her fair share of loss. Her own husband, Dan, had passed from a heart attack 7 years back. That pain had settled into the fine lines around her mouth, hardening her voice, thickening the way she moved. She wasn't cruel, just worn. Grief didn't make her gentle, it made her quiet. Liam, for his part, took the silence as permission. He bundled himself in his oversized wool coat and stomped through the back trail behind their house until he reached the main road. From there, it was 15 minutes to the old chapel, provided he didn't stop too long to admire the icicles hanging from the fence rails or the brittle footprints left by wandering deer. Each time he pushed open the chapel's door, the cold rushed out to meet him like breath exhaled from an old friend. Inside, the same scent of wax, rotted wood, and time greeted him. The pews still stood in their weary rows, and the light through the broken stained glass still poured over the floor in quiet fragments of red and blue. And Whisker was always there. The cat never greeted him with a meow or rub. Instead, Whisker waited perched atop a pew or curled inside a cracked window ledge watching. His green eyes blinked slowly when Liam entered, like an unspoken welcome. His ears, curved gently back in the way only American curl cats could manage, gave him a look of permanent attentiveness. There was no sound between them, no calling out, only a glance, a presence, a knowing. On the third day, Liam brought food. It was half a peanut butter sandwich, pressed in wax paper and clumsily tucked into his coat pocket. He knelt beside the pew where Whisker lay stretched, the cat's tail flicking once in lazy acknowledgement. Liam placed the sandwich beside him without fanfare, then sat cross-legged on the floor, watching as Whisker sniffed it carefully, then took a small bite. "You don't have to eat it," Liam said softly. "I just didn't want to come empty-handed." Whisker paused, then resumed eating. In school, Liam had always been a quiet kid. Not shy exactly, but inward, the kind of boy who'd stare out the window and wonder how trees breathed. His teacher last year, Miss Clara Jennings, a cheerful, red-headed woman in her early 30s, told his mother during a conference, "Liam's the kind of kid who sees the world with his heart, not his eyes." Now, Liam's world had narrowed to the chapel and the cat inside it. He began bringing more things: a folded towel to sit on, a picture book he used to read with his mother called The Quiet Meadow, a scarf, hand-knitted with uneven stitches and pale green yarn, the same scarf his mother used to wear in winter. It still held her scent, faintly, like lavender and snow. One afternoon, as the wind howled through the trees outside and the snow pushed against the chapel windows in gusts, Liam pulled the scarf from his coat. Whisker was curled on the wooden floor, resting his chin on his paws, eyes half closed. "My mom made this," Liam said, unraveling the scarf gently. "She used to say it was too itchy, but she wore it anyway because I picked the color." Whisker didn't move. Liam knelt and draped the scarf over the cat, covering his back and part of his tail. Whisker blinked, but didn't resist. He merely adjusted his position slightly, pressing his side into the warmth. "I think she'd like you," Liam whispered. For a moment, the wind dropped, and silence flooded the room. The kind of silence that wasn't empty but full. Full of memories, of longing, of the ache between one heartbeat and the next. Whisker stretched then, slow and graceful, before curling again, this time his head resting on the edge of the scarf. From then on, Liam stayed longer. He read aloud softly from the picture book, his voice shaky at first, then steadier. He told stories about his mother, the way she laughed at her own jokes, how she always burnt pancakes on purpose because Liam liked the crispy edges, how she sang off-key in the car but only when no one was watching. Whisker never interrupted. He didn't purr, didn't meow, didn't roll onto his back in a plea for belly rubs. He simply listened, his stillness a comfort more than a reaction. Liam had never needed anyone to talk back, he only needed someone who would stay. One evening, as dusk fell and the chapel darkened, Liam sat in the pew with his legs tucked beneath him. Whisker was beside him, pressed lightly against his thigh. Liam rested a hand on the cat's back, fingers curling into the thick fur just above the scarf. "I don't talk at home," he admitted. "Not to Martha. Not to anyone. It feels like if I start, I won't stop, and then it'll all fall apart." Whisker stirred slightly, shifting his weight but not moving away. "But with you, it's quiet, and it doesn't feel empty." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the town again, erasing tracks, softening edges. Inside, a boy and a cat sat in the warm hush of an old chapel, surrounded by dust, stories, and a scarf that still remembered love. They didn't need words. Not here, not now. They only needed each other. The snow had turned from soft powder to brittle crust. It cracked under the weight of boots and tires, and left behind tracks like scars across the otherwise white town of Maple Hollow. Winter lingered in the corners of porches and the branches of bare maple trees, its silence ever present. But silence didn't last long in a town that small. People began to talk. It started with Edna Whitlow, the town's self-proclaimed moral compass and reigning president of the Historical Preservation Society. She was in her early 60s, thin as a rake, with sharp cheekbones and hair dyed a fierce auburn that hadn't occurred in nature in decades. She wore long wool coats and always smelled faintly of peppermint and judgment. Edna had been walking her Doan overweight, wheezing pug named Franklin past the old chapel when she caught a glimpse of Liam slipping in through the side entrance. She paused, squinting beneath her faux fur hat, and pursed her lips with suspicion. The very next morning, Edna stopped by the grocery store where Sarah Moore, a kind but easily influenced woman in her early 40s with round glasses and a nervous laugh, was bagging her groceries. Sarah had 2 daughters in the elementary school and a husband who worked in the county office. "I saw Martha Bell's boy sneaking into the chapel yesterday," Edna had whispered, her voice laced with implication. "Poor thing. And after everything he's been through, but what is he doing there?" You don't think there's something natural in there, do you? By the following day, whispers had turned into murmurs, and murmurs into theories. Some said the chapel was haunted. Others said they'd heard strange sounds at night, low growls, creaking floorboards, shadowy shapes moving behind the stained glass windows. Kids started daring each other to go near it after dark. Someone mentioned fire, just enough to scare out whatever's in there. One boy had said behind the school building, gripping a snowball in one hand and a plastic lighter in the other. Liam, of course, knew nothing of this at first. His days followed a quiet pattern: finish his homework, wait until Martha nodded off in the recliner, and slip away with a piece of bread or a book tucked under his coat. He had started drawing again small sketches of Whisker in different poses and brought the pages with him to leave inside the chapel, like pieces of memory he didn't want to forget. One evening, though, as Liam approached the chapel from the back trail, he noticed something strange. The snow on the side of the building had been trampled. Scattered near the broken side window were pieces of shattered glass that hadn't been there before. And beneath one of the windowsills, so faint it could have been missed, was a smear of dried blood. His heart thundered in his chest. "Whisker?" he called, for the first time ever raising his voice above a whisper. "Whisker!" He burst through the warped door, the hinges groaning as it slammed back against the frame. The chapel was darker than usual. Clouds had swallowed the moonlight, and the colored glow from the stained glass barely painted the room. He rushed down the aisle between the pews, nearly tripping on a loose plank. Then he saw him. Whisker was curled behind the pulpit, one front paw tucked awkwardly beneath his body. His ears flattened slightly at the sound, but his eyes met Liam's instant recognition, then relief, then pain. Liam dropped to his knees beside him. "No, no, no," he murmured, tears stinging his eyes. There was a gash along Whisker's right foreleg, not deep but raw, a bright red slash against the pale cream fur. Tiny shards of glass still clung to the edge of his coat. Liam remembered the broken window, the blood outside, the rumors. Someone had thrown something. "I'm sorry," he whispered, reaching out slowly, gently pressing the scarf he always carried against the wound. "I should have come sooner." Whisker didn't resist. He simply pressed his head forward, nudging his nose into Liam's chest. The movement was slow, deliberate, and full of meaning forgiveness without a sound. And just like that, Liam began to cry. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It started as a quiver in his shoulders, then spilled over. The kind of cry that had waited behind his ribs since the night sirens flashed outside his window. The kind that didn't ask for answers, just space. Whisker stayed close, his small body warm even as his leg trembled with pain. When Liam could finally speak again, his voice cracked. "They're trying to take everything from me. First Mom, now this, but I won't let them take you." Outside, the wind howled against the boards, rattling the chapel like bones in a box. But inside, the space felt still, like the storm had passed through and left only two hearts behind, curled against each other in quiet defiance. Liam stayed the entire night, curled beside Whisker with his coat around both of them. When dawn broke and the chapel filled with pale winter light, Liam made a decision. He couldn't protect Whisker in secret anymore. The town was watching, and this time, he'd speak. The town hall stood at the edge of Maple Hollow's main square, a weathered red brick building with a wooden bell tower that hadn't rung in years. Inside, its meeting room was simpler rows of folding chairs, a cracked linoleum floor, and a podium that tilted slightly to one side. The heating was inconsistent, and the overhead lights flickered when the wind outside blew too hard. But that night, it was packed. Word had spread quickly. There would be a discussion about the situation at the chapel. Martha Bell arrived early, though not by choice. She had been asked to come after her nephew Liam's name had been mentioned by more than one concerned citizen. Dressed in a brown wool coat and a matching scarf, she sat near the back, arms folded, lips pressed into a tight line. She wasn't angry, not exactly, mostly tired. Grief had aged her fast in the last few months. and though she loved Liam in the way that relatives sometimes love by duty more than instinct, she hadn't known what to do with the boy's silence. Beside the podium stood Councilman Mark Godfrey, a tall man in his late 40s with deep-set eyes, a square jaw, and a tendency to talk more than he listened. Mark had lived in Maple Hollow all his life. He considered himself fair-minded, but he had a habit of treating everything like a debate he had already won. Tonight, he wore his gray peacoat indoors, arms crossed as if guarding against an invisible threat. "We've had reports," he began, voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls, "of activity around the old First Parish Chapel, damaged windows, animal sightings. Some folks have expressed concern for public safety. We understand a young boy's been seen entering the property." There were murmurs in the room. Edna Whitlow, seated 2 rows ahead, nodded sharply. Sarah Moore sat beside her, looking uncomfortable, wringing her gloves in her lap. At the edge of the room, Reverend John Gable leaned against the back wall, arms folded. A man in his early 70s with soft gray hair and a long brown overcoat, Reverend John had served as pastor in Maple Hollow for over 40 years. He had retired only last spring, handing the pulpit to a younger minister in a neighboring town. But in many ways, people still turned to him when things became uncertain. He hadn't spoken yet. He was listening. Liam stood just outside the meeting room, small hands clenched into fists inside his jacket pockets. He hadn't planned to come. He hadn't planned anything. But when he overheard Martha mutter about a town meeting after dinner, something had shifted inside him. He had followed her, slipping in through the back hallway, hiding behind the coat rack until now. Now, something in his chest was swelling, not rage, exactly. Something quieter, sharper. He stepped forward. The wooden floor creaked as he entered the room. A few people turned, then more. Martha stiffened in her seat. Liam walked to the center aisle, small boots scuffing the floor. He stopped near the second row, beside an empty chair. His face was pale. His hair hung over his eyes. But when he spoke, his voice was clear. "It's not haunted," he said. A beat. Silence. Everyone looked at him. "It's not dangerous. It's not a monster." He swallowed. "It's a cat." He glanced around the room. His eyes settled on the Reverend, who gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "His name's Whisker," Liam continued. "He's not hurting anyone. He didn't break anything. He just lives there. I've been visiting him since the storm." He paused, fingers tightening. "My mom used to take me there, before she died. I don't talk to anyone since then, but I talked to him. I don't know why, but it felt like she could hear me when I did, like she hadn't left completely." The room was still. "He's the only one who stayed," Liam said, voice soft now. "When everything else left." Silence again. Edna's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Councilman Godfrey looked as if he were about to speak, then closed his folder instead. It was Reverend John who moved first. He stood slowly, pulling on his gloves, then made his way to the aisle. As he passed Liam, he placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you," he said. "That's all we needed to hear." The next morning, just after sunrise, Reverend John walked the half-mile to the chapel. The snow was hard underfoot, and the wind had picked up again, whipping through the bare trees. He carried a brown wool blanket under one arm and a thermos of warm milk in the other. When he reached the chapel, he pushed open the door, now barely hanging on its hinges, and stepped inside. Whisker was there, curled beneath the same pew as always, though his injured leg was stretched slightly to the side. He blinked at the Reverend, but didn't move. John knelt beside him, spreading the blanket open with weathered fingers. He placed it gently over the cat's body, tucking the corners like he would for a child. "Hello, friend," he said. Whisker blinked again, slowly, silently. Reverend John placed the thermos down, unscrewed the lid, and poured a small amount into the cap. He placed it near Whisker, then sat down on the floor beside the pew and sighed. "You've been keeping someone together," he said quietly. I suppose it's my turn now. When he rose, he lifted Whisker carefully, wrapped in the blanket. The cat made no protest. His head rested against the Reverend's chest. Together, they stepped out into the cold morning. The parsonage sat just behind the chapel, a modest clapboard cottage painted a pale shade of blue-gray that faded into the snowy backdrop each winter. It wasn't large, just 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace. But it was warm, quiet, and filled with the scent of pine wood, old books, and the occasional cinnamon roll from the church ladies who still brought them by, even though Reverend John had officially retired. Whisker had claimed the sunny windowsill in the living room as his throne. Wrapped in the same scarf Liam had once draped over him in the chapel, the cat often perched with his legs tucked neatly beneath him, his tail coiled just so, and his ear still gently curled backward, tilted at every sound, as if listening not just to the room but to something beyond it. He was healing. The wound on his leg had scabbed over, and the limp was almost gone. Reverend John had taken him to the town's veterinarian, a gentle, soft-spoken woman named Dr. Karen Winslow, who wore thick glasses and had a laugh that made her German shepherd sit up straight in response. "He's tougher than he looks," she had said while examining Whisker. "Cats like this, they choose their people. They don't get chosen." And so it was that Reverend John, a widower with a house too quiet and too full of memories, had found himself adopted by a cat. Each day after school, Liam arrived. He knocked on the back door politely, though Reverend John had told him a dozen times he didn't need to. Liam liked the ritual. He always brought something with him, a book, a drawing, a new scarf he'd tried to knit himself but gave up halfway through. Whisker would meet him at the door, stretching out on the rug and blinking like an old soul pretending to be a cat. One afternoon in early February, the snow began to melt, leaving small rivers along the curb and patches of dark grass showing through. Liam came with a new book in hand, his mother's worn copy of The Secret Garden. He read aloud while Whisker lay curled beside him, and Reverend John sat in the armchair, sipping coffee and nodding occasionally, as if the words were familiar and still welcome. "You're reading louder these days," John remarked once Liam paused to turn the page. Liam shrugged, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "He listens better when I do." Outside, the town had begun to shift. Rumors had quieted. The chapel had been cleaned, its broken windows replaced by a team of local volunteers, the pews dusted, and the pulpit polished. Edna Whitlow, who had once started the talk about ghosts and trouble, now claimed she had always been a supporter of community heritage. Sarah Moore brought her daughters by with a bouquet of paper flowers and an apology folded in notes. People were funny that way. The rededication of the chapel was Reverend John's idea. "It won't be a full service," he had said one day while stirring sugar into his tea. "Just something small, something to mark the place right again." Flyers were printed and posted in the town square. They didn't say much, just a date, a time, and the words, "A place to remember." On the day of the ceremony, the chapel was filled, though not crowded. Old wood creaked under fresh coats of varnish. Candles flickered along the windowsills, and soft organ music hummed from a portable speaker placed near the altar. People filed in slowly, some out of curiosity, others because they remembered something worth remembering. Liam stood near the front, dressed in a navy sweater and the same brown boots he'd worn in the snow. In his hands, he carried the scarfated green, slightly frayed at the edges, but still warm with memory. Reverend John gave a short speech about healing, about grace, about how even silence has its own kind of prayer. He didn't mention Whisker by name. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew. When the moment came, Liam stepped up to the pulpit. He didn't speak. Instead, he placed the scarf gently across the polished wood, smoothing it flat with his small hands. Then he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small wooden plaque he had carved with John's help. He placed it just below the scarf. The letters, etched by hand and painted with care, read, "Whisker, the cat who stayed when no one else did." A quiet hush settled over the chapel. Not the kind filled with awkwardness or waiting, but the kind born from recognition of sorrow, of survival, of something broken that had begun to mend. After the ceremony, people lingered. They looked at the plaque, asked Liam questions, patted his shoulder. He smiled more that day than he had in the entire year before. And that night, when he curled up beside Whisker on the rug by the fireplace, he told him everything. About school, about Martha learning to bake again, about how he wanted to learn to carve like Reverend John. Whisker didn't answer. He just blinked, slow and steady, then pressed his head gently into Liam's palm. There was no need for words. Not anymore. Sometimes, the ones who heal us don't speak. They don't offer advice. They simply stay long enough for our hearts to remember how to beat again. If this story touched something quiet inside you, leave a comment below and tell us who your Whisker was. A pet, a person, or a memory, someone who stayed when no one else did. And if you believe love still finds us in the silence, share this story so it might reach someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Fearless Paws for more stories of healing, hope, and the animals who never give up on us. And may God bless those who wait with love in the quiet.